Hi, it's Simon here from Analog Anorak. This video is going to be about Decca's Jubilee reissue series. I've collected quite a lot of these records over the years and I've picked out 6 of my favourites. This series came out in 1977 and was loosely linked to Queen Elizabeth's Silver Jubilee celebrations. But unlike most of the tap that came out that year linked to those celebrations, this series really had great staying power. It actually lasted around a decade and went through at least 3 different incarnations over the years. The records that I've chosen do span those 10 years, and I will tell you a little bit about the different versions. I'm also going to cover some of the issues around what happened to Decca over the 1980s. Unlike the golden period of stereo, the 80s has been rather patchily covered, and some of the information is a bit incomplete in places. I hope I haven't made any major mistakes, but if there are any problems or inaccuracies, please contribute to the comments section, as it is really useful. It was really helpful while preparing this video that I came across a website called madeinwalthamstow.com. This website is the work of Rob Davison. He worked at Polygram's Walthamstow pressing factory in the late 70s and early 80s. In the long run, he's hoping to write a book about this period. Rob was particularly helpful in giving me extra information about Walthamstow's role during the Polygram Takeover period. I'll start off with this brochure I found in one of my Jubilee record sleeves. It comes from the 1980s and it's quite a good summary. It covers the first 101 releases on the Jubilee label, and it also mentions the main purpose of the Jubilee series. It wanted to focus in on the well-known classical compositions. The reissues were some of the most acclaimed performances in the back catalogue, and it mainly featured some of the big-named conductors and artists from the early 60s onwards. It also favoured recordings by the VPO, which does mean that you get the complete Beethoven Schmidt-Ischerstedt symphony cycle, as well as the Mazel-Sibelius and the Cortez Brahms symphony cycles. As this series was made in the late 80s, it did benefit from Decca having more modern cutting head technology. Another positive that this series is renowned for is the lower noise floor of the grooves. From the mid-70s, Decca stopped using those dodgy inner sleeves that had that risk and tendency to become tacky and interact with the vinyl. And this means that this series is a good reliable bet if you're collecting second-hand classical music via mail order with no ability to look at the vinyl yourself. My first 2 favourite records come from the period 1977 to 79, which is the period where these records were still pressed by the new Malden factory. I've chosen 2 records originally on the SXL label, which were superb performances from the early 60s. We've got JB10, which is the late period Ensemble Chabré compilation, recorded in Victoria Hall in 1964. The other reissue I've chosen is JB10, which is a Kingsway Hall classic from 1960. It's George Solti conducting the orchestra of the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, and it's got that classic Solti hallmark of a pacey, tight, exciting performance. These pressings were mastered by 2 of the legendary mastering engineers from Decca. They both started working for Decca in the mid-60s. Now, most Decca engineers, after starting off in the mastering department, would move on to other roles. But these 2, they just stuck with doing the mastering for a very long period, and they ultimately became the 2 artisans at cutting records for Decca. This one was mastered by Harry Fisher, and we know this because the stamp on the dead wax has the letter W, which is his code. Harry Fisher definitely has a very robust reputation amongst audiophiles for high quality, reliable cuts. He often did the lion's share of cutting reissue series. This wasn't the case, however, with the Jubilee series. I've read that sadly in the late 70s Harry Fisher passed away. This meant that the other mastering artisan, Ted Burkett, had to contribute more to this reissue series than normal. The Chabrier here is a fine example of Burkett's cutting work. So if you come across this record and see a G stamped on the dead wax, that indicates it's a Ted Burkett pressing and well worth buying. New Malden pressings are pretty easy to identify because they feature a slightly smaller label than usual. Because of that, it's situated on a larger raised vinyl circle and it almost appears like the label has shrunk in the wash. New Malden had been pressing Decca records since 1949. During that period, there'd been an excellent quality control feedback between the New Malden factory and the mastering at Hampstead. So all of the New Malden mastered records do benefit from the incremental improvements over the years. On top of this, with mastering engineers like Burkett and Fisher, you get the cherry on the top of sometimes these sensational cuts. Despite this series being described as a mid-price series, the quality of the records produced is so similar to the equivalent SXLs that were coming out at that time. It's no wonder they sold so well. In 1980, Decca Records was taken over by Polygram. For a very short period, Polygram had 2 record pressing factories in London. Polygram almost immediately decided to close down the New Malden factory. This was done suddenly and brutally with complete workforce mass redundancies. From an audiophile perspective, it can seem quite mystifying why New Malden was the one to be closed with such high quality product coming out. But when you look from the Polygram perspective, the Walthamstow Polygram factory had a lot going for it. In the 50s, it had started off as Philips' UK-based pressing plant. After 1973, when Philips amalgamated to form the Polygram organisation, the Walthamstow factory did take on Polygram equipment and practices. Rob Davison told me that when he started there in 1978, he was told that they had only quite recently had their hand-operated pressing equipment replaced by fully automatic PRA presses. So when you look at things from the Polygram perspective, New Malden was up against a plant that had received significant investment and had Polygram approved equipment already in place. After the New Malden closure, the Decca mastering department in Hampstead was left well alone. So after the New Malden factory was shut, most of the actual pressing took place at the Baarn factory, which was previously the Philips headquarters in the Netherlands. But a significant minority of the pressing continued in the UK at the Polygram Walthamstow factory well into 1986. As Baarn and Walthamstow had very standardised procedures and equipment, it's not surprising that the end product visually looks identical and sounds very similar too. This does mean that the commonly used term Dutch pressings to describe 1980s Decca pressings onwards is a bit inaccurate and in some ways is better described as Polygram pressings. I'm going to feature 4 Polygram pressings and they do divide up neatly into 2 batches. The Polygram pressings are different in appearance and definitely in weight, with them being lighter. The labels are larger and there's a raised vinyl ring circumference around the label. The appearance of the labels quickly changed in the 80s, going from the standard white design to one that featured red and blue rings around the circumference. Fortunately, it's really easy to tell the Walthamstow and Baarn pressings apart, because the Walthamstow ones usually somewhere on the label say made in England, with the Baarn ones saying made in Holland. With this being a budget reissue series, Polygram did make some financial decisions, and quite a significant number of Polygram releases actually utilised earlier Decca metal parts. I've got a couple here, and initially I'll just tell you about the records. So here we have JB36, which is Enseme's classic French music compilation featuring 2 works by Ravel, 1 by Honegger and 1 by Ducasse. The earliest Jubilee pressings were done at New Malden, but the vinyl definitely indicates that this is a Polygram pressing, and this one was done at Walthamstow. And this is a fine sounding pressing of a magical performance. The second gem of a recording I've chosen is this one, with Benjamin Britten conducting the English Chamber Orchestra at Snape Maltings, which has its lovely, unique acoustic qualities. In its SXL incarnation, this was called Britten Conducts Mozart. It features a beautiful rendition of Symphony No. 40 and Serenade No. 6. When I was going through the enjoyable process of selecting out my favourites, this one really jumped out as one I had to include. This record is labelled as JB107, so there's definitely no Jubilee New Malden pressing. It's labelled as made in Holland, so it definitely came from the Baarn factory. If you look at the dead wax on both of these records, they have the very clear typical early Decca stamp, which indicates that these metal parts were done before Polygram took over. The Enseme one in particular is really interesting. Rob Davidson told me that because New Malden was shut so quickly, that the projects in progress at that time were not completed at New Malden, where they were originally planned to be pressed. Instead, the metal parts were diverted over to the Walthamstow plant to be pressed there instead. The code stamped on side 1 of this record indicates it's a Ted Burkett mastered record. Side 2 is really unusual in that it's got a very brief, hurried looking hand-etched code. It does really look like it was done in a rush, and I think this strongly suggests that this was one of the records that was originally intended to be finished off at New Malden and instead went to Walthamstow. The other record shows the old style stamp and is actually the work of Harry Fisher, which makes me wonder whether this metal part was from work Fisher did earlier with a narrowband SXL. So as far as these Polygram pressings that used the earlier Decca metal parts, they may lack a little bit of the finesse of the final New Malden stage, but still a lot of the quality does come through on these pressings. So it's well worth checking to see if there are the old style stamper types, and also whether W or G were involved as well. Although Polygram did take advantage of the stock of metal parts that ultimately all ended up in Baarn, there were completely new mastering activities carried out in Hampstead from 1980 onwards. The final 2 records are a couple of completely new cuts. The way you can easily identify completely new cutting activities is by looking at the dead wax. In contrast to the old Decca stamp, the Polygram stamp is more spaced out and kind of curved around the label. It includes an upside down triangle, which seems to be the Polygram moniker. Fortunately, they did retain the mastering engineer code, so we still continue to know who carried out the mastering. So before we start looking at the last 2 records, from what I've read, it does sound like the Decca engineers involved, when they managed to listen to some of the very earliest vinyl pressings coming from the Polygram factories, they weren't that impressed with the results. But fortunately, things did get better over time. My observations are there is definitely some variability in the quality of the pressings, and it does seem to be more pronounced with the ones produced in about 1980-81. Common criticisms that are levelled at some of the Jubilee Polygram pressings is that they can be a little bit light on the bass and lack the heft of some of the new Malden pressings. And I have within my collection a few of these records that just don't sound right from the start. And it does seem to be related to this acoustic concert hall signature not being captured correctly. I've got this example of one of the Duff ones in my collection, which is a remake of JB14, and I would definitely say get the new Malden one, because this one, it just doesn't sound like the Sophian Sal. But fortunately these unrewarding ones are in the minority. Over time things got better, and they must have started to iron out some of the problems that were going on with the first batch. I've noticed across the board with Decca classical music pressings done by Polygram, it's around 1984 onwards that you start to come across some pressings that are exceptional. They never regain the new Malden sound, but they are wonderful pressings, and they often excel in detail and accuracy. One relevant change that occurred by 1984 is that Ted Burkett started to take more of a backseat again as far as involvement with reissues, and the assignments he got tended to be the high-profile new releases, including the new digital equivalents of the SXLs. With these last two pressings, we do get some new blood as far as mastering engineers. Not too new actually, because they joined in the late 70s, around the time Harry Fisher died. So they definitely had quite a few years of expertise under their belts. My final couple of gems comes right from the end period of the Jubilee series. By this point, the classic white top border had been dropped. The other thing about the really late pressings is that they drop the JB numbering and instead use an anonymous set of numbers. The first choice pressing is this one from Walthamstow from around 1984, and it's that classic session originally on the Argo label with Neville Marriner and the Academy of St Martin in the Field doing the Stravinsky, Pulcinella and Apollo suites. And it's one of their absolutely superb performances of some glorious life-affirming pieces. I've put this pressing up against a Ted Burkett early Argo equivalent, and it really holds its own and possibly even beats that. This one is another Benjamin Britten conducted work, this time of his own piece, Spring Symphony. The late Polygram cuts do sometimes include an extra track. This one is the charming Simple Symphony, actually taken from the recording session I mentioned earlier of the Britten Conducts Mozart. But the main choral piece is much earlier, from 1960s Kingsway Hall. This Baarn pressing is fabulous. With a lot of early SXLs, I do have some first pressing mono equivalents, and they often really hold their own, but this one absolutely annihilates the mono valve equivalent. These really late pressings include the final incarnation of the label. The centre moves from being a light blue to a silver. And as far as differentiating between Baarn and Walthamstow, it continues to be an easy job of just reading on the label whether it says made in England or made in Holland. But I've got to admit, some of the text is absolutely minute in this final incarnation. Going back to the issue of the new mastering engineers who started in the late 70s, this Stravinsky record does include a side each from the two most common codes that you see on the dead wax. The letters are V and X. Now, as far as the identity of V, it seems to be fairly certain that this was an engineer called Quentin Williams, but there seems to be no information on the identity of X. I think I recall reading somewhere someone suggested that X might have been a catch-all letter. I've listened to quite a lot of pressings with Exxon from the 80s though, and I do get the impression it was the work of a single person rather than whoever was available at the time. But if you do come across a V and an X, particularly these late pressings, you do stand a chance of getting an exceptionally good pressing. The Baarn pressing on both sides is the work of Quentin Williams. And over my shoulder there's another Benjamin Britten record that is of exceptional quality and came very close to being included. So the Jubilee label kind of fizzled out in around 1987. I hope I've been able to convey that the early new Malden pressings are a very reliable bet, and also given a few pointers as far as trying to maximise the chances of getting the exceptional Polygram pressings. I will actually be sticking with this era and with Walthamstow in my next video. Walthamstow in the end suffered a similar fate to the new Malden in the late 80s, but before it closed, Walthamstow alone was responsible for a really unique series of classical music, which I want to feature in depth in the next video, because there are some features about this series that are a lot of fun, but quite jaw-dropping at times too. So until then, take care, bye.